Between 2010 and 2017, vulnerable men keep disappearing from Toronto's gay village. Are they simply leaving of their own accord?
There were an awful lot of occurrences of missing men, guys who just wanted to disappear. Do we have a serial killer? We just simply did not know.
The same name keeps crossing detectives' desks, but he makes an unlikely suspect.
He lived in a family that was very religious.
He comes across as a very soft-spoken, very gentle, older man.
While investigators gather the evidence they need, the suspect is free to target new victims.
I had said he is not allowed to go behind a closed door with another man.
It's a tragedy. It's a horrific tragedy.
What would it take to prove the guilt of a man who'd evaded detection for almost a decade? Which part of the puzzle?
Appointments that were missed, text messages and emails that were missed. Right away, people knew something was wrong and it was completely out of character.
The investigation into Andrew's disappearance would be run by Detective Hank Itzinger.
I'm a 30-year member of the Toronto Police Service. I've worked in our homicide squad since 2005. And in late 2012, I became involved in an investigation referred to as Project Houston.
Project Houston was launched after a spate of disappearances from Toronto's gay villages some 7 years earlier.
Scanna Navaratnam went missing in late 2010.
He had last been seen in the early hours of September 6th, leaving a bar near Church Street with an unknown male. 40-year-old Sri Lankan refugee Skanda felt that he had found his forever home in Toronto's gay community.
For a long time, the Church and Wellesley community has been a center in the city for the queer community in terms of being a place to gather, to socialize, to celebrate, to find support.
I think when people talk about the church neighborhood, they think of it as overall a safe neighborhood. It's known for being a very open and tolerant space. It's the site of the gay pride parades, and it's a space that draws LGBTQ folks from all over the country and other countries.
Skanda's disappearance went unsolved, and over the next 2 years, 2 more men were reported missing. Abdul Basir Faizi was a 42-year-old husband and father. His family knew nothing about his secret visits to gay bars. He was reported missing in December 2010. In October 2012, another family man who was leading a double life disappeared from Toronto's streets, 58-year-old Majid Kayhan.
You had people, who had full lives, social lives, support networks, families, hobbies. There was no logic to why they would suddenly disappear.
You've got 3 missing men between 2010 and 2012. We simply did not know what had happened to them.
Then, in late 2012, an unexpected lead.
After several men had gone missing, there was a tip that linked one of the men to a potential international or some kind of cannibal ring.
The police in Switzerland were contacted by an informant. The informant told them he was part of an online cannibal fetish community, and he had been chatting with a user on the website who was identified at the time as John Jacob. And John Jacob told this informant that he had killed and eaten a brown-skinned male from Toronto's gay village. So the informant went online himself to see if there were any murder victims or missing men from Toronto's gay village, and he happened to find the press release about Scanna Navaratnam. It sounds like a bit of an unbelievable story, but the last time he had given them similar information, it was about a cannibal in Slovakia. Based on his information, the police in Slovakia ended up finding a cannibal serial killer and finding multiple victims around his property. Now that you have a witness who is telling you he's been privy to an online confession Now it becomes a murder investigation as opposed to a missing persons investigation.
It was an intriguing lead, but it came to nothing. The individual posting online about killing and eating another man was nothing more than a fantasist.
Well, the conclusions that we came to essentially in May of 2013 was John Jacob was not responsible for killing Scandan Navaratnam or any of these men. And at that time, there was no evidence to say any of those men had been murdered.
Project Houston did not find the missing men, and in 2013, after all leads had been exhausted, the investigation was brought to a close. But 3 years later, men began going missing from Church and Wellesley again.
Sarush Mahmoodi, again a South Asian male, married in the closet.
A 50-year-old professional painter, Surush, was another refugee, this time from Iran. He was last seen in August 2015 near the home in Scarborough, Toronto, that he shared with his family. His wife notified police when he failed to return home from work one summer evening. The police were unable to trace him. In spring 2017, another man was reported missing, Selim Esen. He was a 44-year-old Turkish citizen. The last known sighting of him was at his home near Church and Wellesley around April 15th.
Selim Esen, a lot like Scandan Navaratnam, a resident of the gay village, didn't have a permanent address, wasn't reported missing for about 2 weeks after he disappeared.
5 missing men over a 7-year period. Police couldn't tell if the incidents were linked. Was a predator targeting some of the most vulnerable members of Toronto's LGBT community? At this stage, detectives were unsure.
Do we have a serial killer? We just simply did not know at that point in time what we were dealing with.
These are people who do not receive the same kinds of attention from the media or from police when they go missing. If you look on the West Coast to the story of the Highway of Tears, there are generations of missing and murdered Indigenous people who have vanished without, much media attention or, police resources to find them. And serial killers are very aware of these things. They know that they can get away with it with certain people easier than others.
But when Andrew Kinsman disappeared in summer 2017, there was a new surge of interest in solving the mystery of Toronto's missing men.
Andrew Kinsman probably had the most prominent stature in terms of the most social connections, did a lot of volunteer work with queer organizations, and so his disappearance compared to others really got on the radar, and he had a group of people who were really advocating for his disappearance to receive high priority in the investigation.
Kinsman had last been seen near to his home in the Victorian neighbourhood of Cabbagetown, northeast of Toronto city centre, on June 26. A man of regular routines, detectives were able to focus on his last known movements.
One thing that jumped out from the surveillance video from the neighborhood was a red Dodge Caravan that circled the block twice right around the time when Andrew Kinsman went missing, which was at about 2:30 in the afternoon, June 26. They were able to find it on a camera a couple of blocks away from Andrew Kinsman's house. There's over 6,000 red Dodge Caravans in the city of Toronto. But we also knew on Andrew Kinsman's calendar, he had an appointment noted, Bruce. So out of those over 6,000 red Dodge Caravans, how many of them were registered to somebody named Bruce? There were 5. One of them being Bruce McArthur.
It was a name Hank Itzinger and his colleagues had heard before. It had cropped up 5 years earlier during Project Houston, the investigation into the disappearances of Scandan Navaratnam, Basia Faizi and Majid Kayhan. The force's computer experts had been trawling the gay hookup websites used by some of the missing men in an effort to find out who they may have met up with in the days before they went missing.
We had identified a username of Silver Fox as being somebody that we wanted to interview in relation to these missing persons.
Silver Fox was the online handle used from time to time by Bruce McArthur.
In November of 2013, 51 Division actually identified who Silver Fox was and interviewed Bruce McArthur. He was strictly a witness at the time of the interview.
His name now linked half a decade later to yet another missing persons case. Could McArthur shed any light on the disappearances?
McArthur was brought to the attention of the police for having assaulted a male prostitute in a bar.
As detectives in Toronto, Canada looked into the disappearance of 6 men, the same name had twice appeared on their radar. Who was Bruce McArthur? Did anything about his background make him a likely suspect?
We know that McArthur came from a religious household, right? His father was Presbyterian, his mother was Catholic, and that there was some bullying of him by his father. At least what McArthur alleges is that his father was harder on him because he sensed his son's lack of masculinity.
He grew up in a world that was very intolerant and that was not accepting of people who were not straight, and that this was something that he may have been struggling with for who knows how long. This could have been something he could have been having desires to be with other boys and men since his adolescence or teenage years. He lived in a world where, in a sense, he had to hide his true self from not only his family, but the rest of the world. And this can be a very traumatic experience for a young person to grow up in a world where you feel like you constantly have to have a mask.
Detectives found out that it wasn't until his late 40s that McArthur felt able to let the mask slip a little.
McArthur was married for 25 years. This isn't uncommon. He told his wife. He came out to his wife and left her and had this sort of second birth, this rebirth, into the gay world, started socializing in the gay bars, meeting other gay men. Toronto has a very active, vibrant gay community.
It's a neighborhood that has a long-standing history for being this space that is very tolerant towards LGBTQ folks. It has a very active nightlife. There are bars, there are, sex clubs. There's a lot of activity, and somebody like Bruce McArthur, after living repressed for so long, comes to this and he feels like a kid in a candy store.
He starts meeting other gay men, tall, short, out-of-towners, foreigners, masculine and feminine.
He's at this point somebody who's very eager to get caught up with this life that he's been repressing for so long. He throws himself wholeheartedly into this lifestyle and tries to really catch up on time that he's missed.
As they studied his habits and pastimes, officers discovered a man who participated in the wider community in positive ways.
He comes across as a very soft-spoken, very gentle, older man who played Santa in a shopping mall.
He worked as a landscape gardener and was popular with his wealthy, often elderly clients. But combing through old arrest records, officers also discovered another side to McArthur. They found that the transition into his new lifestyle of a gay single man had not always gone smoothly.
We know that in 2001, McArthur was brought to the attention of the police for having assaulted a male prostitute in a bar. He claims that it was a result of him being off his medication for epilepsy.
I think this shows that he's beginning to experiment with different kinds of domination, and that he's enjoying the sense of power that he has over people. At this stage, it can still be purely sexual. He also may have felt rejected in that moment and felt angered by the fact that he was finally trying to live his true life, his true self, and embrace this, and then somebody told him no.
McArthur was sentenced to 2 years probation. A psychological assessment concluded that the risk for further violence from him was very minimal. Reading the report 16 years later in 2017, investigators wondered if the incident was a red flag.
As part of his probation arrangement, McArthur is ordered to stay out of the gay area of Toronto. This would have been, in my opinion, the straw that broke the camel's back. This was the stress. He's finally come out of the closet. He's leading this life that he enjoys leading, and now he's barred.
If the probation condition was intended to protect Toronto's gay population from McArthur's violent tendencies, detectives would later discover it had not been successful. In June 2016, McArthur had once again come to the attention of the police.
There's an incident in North Toronto where Mr. McArthur is arrested for choking a male in the back of his van.
The same red Dodge van seen passing Andrew Kinsman's house the day that he was last seen alive.
He was interviewed by the police, and he just sort of denied what happened. The database wasn't searched to look for the prior conviction, and they just believed his word. And that was that. That was the end of that 2016 investigation. There were just a litany of examples where you could have caught McArthur that weren't followed up on.
Looking back in 2017 at the spate of suspicious disappearances, Hank Itzinger's team realized that there were plenty of reasons to view McArthur as a potential suspect.
The 2001 occurrence comes up, and in the meantime, since the 2013 interview, there's also an incident in 2016, so that's a red flag that goes up as well. So the investigation focuses at that point in time on Bruce McArthur.
In August 2017, Toronto police launched Project Prism, a new task force to investigate the disappearances of Andrew Kinsman and Salim Essen. McArthur was their prime suspect, but they needed more evidence. Finding his van was an urgent priority.
In the days following the public announcement of Project Prism, he gets rid of the red Dodge Caravan.
Discovering that McArthur's rusted van was no longer in his possession, officers from the Project Prism team began the painstaking process of contacting every second-hand dealer and wrecking yard in the Toronto area. In late September, they finally struck gold at an auto parts business 66 kilometers outside of the city. What they discovered would be the first significant break in the investigation.
The red Dodge Caravan is forensically examined, and in the back of the van there is blood, which is found and eventually identified as belonging to Andrew Kinsman. So once we have that information in November 2017, now it becomes evidence of a murder, and evidence obviously linking McArthur to that murder.
It was compelling evidence of McArthur's involvement in whatever had happened to Andrew Kinsman. But what about the other missing men? Were they alive? Or had they become victims of a serial killer? Detectives decided not to bring the suspect in just yet.
We have as much surveillance as we can muster, keeping an eye on him, identifying his associates. He lived in a high-rise apartment building, and he had a roommate. Surveillance was able to identify an opportunity in the middle of the night where we'd be able to go in to his apartment.
There was much more that investigators needed to find out about McArthur's activities.
We were headed down the path of preparing a wiretap investigation. And once we had the blood, we had enough evidence where we could go to a judge and get a warrant to allow us to surreptitiously enter his apartment and clone his computer. You can imagine the logistics of obtaining that judicial authorization to do it, having the surveillance teams watching him around the clock, having tech officers ready to go at a moment's notice, and also forensic investigators to take photographs as we're executing the warrant. The date was December the 7th of 2017. We were able to go into his apartment, clone 45% of his computer before our surveillance team notifies us he's actually headed back. So we have to get out of there, and we were lucky enough to be able to get that 45% of his computer.
What digital analysts found on McArthur's hard drive was more shocking than they could ever have imagined.
He created a file for each of his victims. We found photographs of the victims as he posed them post-mortem.
When Project Prism officers examined Bruce McArthur's digital footprint, they were left with little doubt that they were on the trail of a serial killer.
He created a file for each of his victims. He had photographs in there of them when they were alive, photographs that he had taken of them, photographs of them on camping trips with a couple of the victims, photographs of them in previous visits and relationship-type photographs. But he also had photographs in there, posed post-mortem photographs.
The images showed the bodies of the murdered men in posed positions, partially clothed or dressed in a fur coat, an unlit cigar hanging from their lips. The photos also revealed two other unknown victims. They had never been reported missing. Kiroshna Kumar Kanagaratnam, a 37-year-old Sri Lankan refugee who hadn't been seen since December 2015.
We had photographs which we had recovered from McArthur's computer of what turned out to be Kumar Kanagaratnam, and we had no idea who he was, and so we had to release that to the media.
A clear pattern was emerging in what kinds of victims McArthur chose to target.
Kumar Kanagaratnam was a refugee claimant from Sri Lanka, outstanding immigration warrant for him, never reported as missing. And we can only narrow down the timeline of his murder very loosely. He was a refugee aboard a bit of a infamous cargo ship called the Sunsea, which docked in Vancouver in 2010 with several hundred refugee claimants on board. So really sad, vulnerable victims, most of them. McArthur, I think, got very careful after that 2013 interview to target some people who he knew probably wouldn't be reported missing.
There were photos, too, of another unknown victim.
Dean Lissowick, who, again, was never reported as missing, was a resident of the shelter system in Toronto.
McArthur sought out a certain type of victim. Immigrants, individuals who may not have had their whole family with them in Toronto. This fits the profile of the type of serial killer who goes for a victim that will not go noticed if they go missing.
Certain that they were dealing with a serial killer, detectives used McArthur's digital activities to build a picture of how he had become a killer and why he had chosen to take so many lives.
He stumbles across this website, which is a fetish website. It's known for bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, BDSM.
Once he had discovered this world, it was something that intrigued and excited McArthur, and he knew exactly the role he wanted to play.
He assumes a more dominant role, the dom, if you will, and seeks out these men who are the subordinates.
For McArthur and his sexual partners, this could have been a consensual way of enjoying one another's company, but McArthur seems to have enjoyed going beyond what was normal or safe.
Sometimes what happens is that you have a person who is experimenting with rough sex, is immersing themselves in a world of bondage and domination, and they, enjoy the power that they feel over another person, and it gets to this tipping point where the violence in play escalates to a point where they feel swept up in the moment, and the violence takes over, and it becomes fatal. And in the aftermath, they relive those moments, and they realize how much they enjoyed killing.
It had happened once. Perhaps McArthur saw no reason why it should not happen again. And again.
Once he decided he was going to kill, he would create those folders, and definitely speaks to premeditation.
The power, the thrill of dominating them up to the point of killing them is a rush, and they continue having that sense of power by treating the remains, the corpses of their victims, like dolls. They have this sense of complete and utter domination over them, and they enjoy the sense of humiliation and shame that they can, put these poor people through.
In the early days of 2018, Bruce McArthur was under constant surveillance as investigators gathered the evidence they needed to prove the full extent of his crimes.
January the 18th, it was a Thursday morning. We had a surveillance team following him, and I had said he is not allowed to go behind a closed door with another man. So let's just keep following him, and unless he does that, we're going to leave him alone until Saturday morning. Well, Murphy's Law, of course, Thursday morning, he picks up a male who we had seen him pick up before, and he takes him back to his apartment at about 10 o'clock in the morning.
The man in McArthur's apartment was at risk of becoming his next victim. Surveillance officers needed to act fast.
The investigator calls me and says he's gone into his apartment with another male. We're going to go and arrest him. So within 18 minutes, I believe, of them seeing him go into the building, they knocked on the door, and Mr. McArthur came to the door, and he was placed under arrest right there and then for 2 counts of murder. And the 9th victim, who has never been publicly identified, I'll call him John, was found tied to McArthur's bed, and he had had a hood placed over his head by McArthur, and he had managed to wiggle the hood off of his head. And sure enough, there was a file folder on McArthur's computer with the name of that 9th victim on it. So there's no doubt in my mind, whether it had been that day or a subsequent day, that John would have been victim number 9.
6 men reported missing. Another 2 identified from McArthur's macabre photo album. But the hard work was not over for Project Prism. No bodies had been found. Victims, friends and families had no prospect of closure. McArthur was a landscape gardener. Had this given him a unique opportunity to conceal 8 bodies? Detectives searched the properties where they knew he had lived and worked.
We were able to obtain our search warrants for the properties, and the one property where ultimately all the victims were found was on Mallory Crescent here in Toronto, and the ravine behind Mallory Crescent. This was a location where McArthur stored his landscaping equipment, and it was an older couple who actually owned the house, but they had vacation property in Northern Ontario. So he really had open access to the property during summer months. And you can imagine their shock and their surprise when we show up and basically tell them, you have to get out of your house. We don't know where we're going to be able to give it back to you.
But with temperatures rarely creeping above freezing that January, excavating the ground was going to prove difficult.
It was a really, really cold winter here in Toronto. So the ground was frozen solid, and the canine units were first used on the property on Mallory Crescent, and one of the dogs gave us an indication on a planter, and the planter was frozen solid. So we ended up seizing 3 planters, and we brought them to our property bureau because they had to thaw out so we could search them. They started thawing out, and then the smell of decomposition coming from them was so bad that we were pretty confident that there was something in those planters.
Investigators waited in hopes of evidence that would bring Project Prism to a neat conclusion and allow 8 missing men to finally be laid to rest.
Every time we identified another victim, we laid another murder charge.
Excavations and exhumations are rarely simple procedures. In January 2018, Hank Itzinger's team were facing an unusually complex operation to recover the remains of 8 murder victims. A series of giant garden planters were the focus of the search.
We ended up taking them to the morgue. The first thing the pathologist was able to do was x-ray one of the planters. You could make out that there was what appeared to be a rib cage in that planter.
It was the first of many disturbing discoveries by forensic experts.
They had to hoist this planter using a crane up onto an examination table and then use power saws to cut away the sides of the planters. And the first planter that they cut open, there were some human remains found in that planter, and subsequently in the other planters that we recovered from Mallory Crescent were the bulk of 7 of the 8 victims.
All of them had been dismembered. Some showed signs of strangulation.
Bruce McArthur's methods for killing suggest that he was somebody who enjoyed having control. He was somebody who enjoyed dominating his victims and feeling the sense of power, the thrill of having power over another human life. This is something that he expressed with bondage and with binding his victims. It's also something that we see quite often in victims who enjoy strangulation. His methods for disposing victims show that he's somebody who's very calculating and rational. He's using objects that he has access to, which are planters, to hide the remains of his victims. This is also something that allows him to revisit these places where, he feels a connection to the remains of these victims that he's killed.
The actual identification of the remains in the planters needs to be based on dental records, fingerprints, or DNA. Andrew Kinsman was in one of the planters, and Andrew had had titanium knee replacements. So when we found a set of titanium knee replacements in the remains, we were pretty confident that that was Andrew Kinsman. But he was actually still preserved enough that we were able to identify his fingerprints. Andrew was identified by fingerprints. Kumar Kanagaratnam was identified by fingerprints. Dean Lisselwick, who was never reported missing, was identified from the photographs that found on McArthur's computer, and then ultimately DNA from the remains. The majority of them were identified through either DNA or dental records at the end of the day.
McArthur's method of hiding his victim's body was not only practical, it may also have given him an illicit thrill whenever he was near their remains.
McArthur discards of his victims' bodies in the same place that he's working, in these gardens, in these pots. Now, one could perhaps assume that this is a disregard for his victims. McArthur might have wanted them close to him. These would have been his totems, his trophies, his talisman around him while he's working.
Bruce McArthur kept lots of mementos from his victims, including their hair. And this is another common practice amongst killers. They enjoy having small items that remind them of their victims. These are things that serial killers return to between kills because it gives them a small dose of the rush that they felt when they killed. But ultimately, over time, the gratification they get from these items begins to taper off, and they begin to seek out a new victim because these items can't ever live up to the real thing, to the act of killing another person.
Over the course of 5 long weeks, investigators continued to unearth human remains.
Every time we identified another victim, we laid another murder charge. And every time we did that, we had to bring McArthur back to court, advise him of the new charge, and put him before the courts again. And he never said anything during any of those interactions.
Throughout spring and into summer, specialist officers continued to search McArthur's home and places of work, as well as a forested ravine behind the property where 7 sets of human remains had been found. They discovered a bag in his bedroom containing duct tape, a surgical glove, rope, zip ties, a bungee cord and syringes. They also uncovered another body.
It wasn't until July until we recovered the 8th victim from he was in a rubber garbage can that was buried in the ravine at the back of Mallory Crescent.
The 8th victim was Majid Kayhan, missing since mid-October 2012. After the biggest forensic investigation in Toronto's history, the search for victims and evidence came to an end in late July 2018. The police had their case against Bruce McArthur.
In January of 2019, he pled guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder.
In February 2019, Bruce McArthur was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 8 men. He will be eligible for parole in 25 years when he will be 91 years old. For Detective Hank Itzinger, it had been a case like no other, a serial killer who terrorized a community.
I've never dealt with anyone like Bruce McArthur. To see what it is he did, the absolute terror he brought down upon the city, and it touches the gay village and the gay population of Toronto, but it touches everybody else in Toronto as well.
It makes me feel deeply pained that these men lost their lives. They had family members who loved them. They were navigating the issues in their lives the best they could, and that their lives were cut short in such a brutal and meaningless manner is horrifying and deeply tragic.
How had McArthur been able to continue his killing spree unnoticed over a period of years? Some believe the answer lies in the way the killer presented himself.
He's somebody who was able to use his lifestyle and his identity, his race, his occupation to elude authorities. He was a chameleon. He's somebody who wore a mask and presented himself as just a normal, typical guy.
Looking at a photograph of Bruce McArthur, or even sitting down and talking to him face to face, I think anybody would be absolutely shocked to find out what exactly he had done. You wouldn't think for 1 second that this guy was capable of doing what he did.
People said they never would have suspected him to become, you know, to be found to be the killer.
You wouldn't think for a second that he was a serial killer, and that's a scary thing.
Sociologist Ju-Young Lee believes that McArthur, like many serial killers, used religion as a front to hide his darker side.
A lot of times when we think about serial killers, we assume that they resemble the kinds of characters we see in movies, like Hannibal Lecter from Silence of that they just embody evil in everything they do, and that they couldn't possibly be involved in something like a church. But there are many serial killers over time who, have been a part of churches. Dennis Rader, for example, also known as the BTK killer in Wichita, Kansas, was a long-time member of his church and was, by most accounts, somebody who was a respected member of his society. In Bruce McArthur's case, you see this story of a guy who perhaps saw the church as an institution that would help him construct this life, this disguise that would, conceal what he was doing.
McArthur may also have developed his early experiences of killing to perfect his practice.
One thing we know about serial killers is that they learn, they develop better strategies and techniques over time because they make mistakes, and they begin to develop a routine, a ritual that they use to not only perfect the way they kill people, but also to conceal evidence of the killing itself. Bruce McArthur may have been somebody who began sort of getting swept up in the moment and killing his first victim, and then in the aftermath realizing he liked it. But over time, because this is a career of killing that spans quite a bit of time, he's somebody who is perfecting his technique and is learning from past mistakes, and is becoming very organized and careful in his thought process. And that includes selecting victims, that includes how to dispose of their remains so that he doesn't get caught. He's somebody who's, continuously refining his strategies and getting better at it over time.
McArthur avoided ever using his real name online, met with victims in places that weren't covered by CCTV, and avoided contacting them by mobile phone. Activists like lawyer Shakir Rahim believe there's another dimension to McArthur's ability to evade detection: the race, sexuality, precarious living arrangements, or economic status of his victims.
The fact that it took so much work to make people accept and understand that the racial and sexuality dimension of this case was part of why McArthur was able to continue what he was doing for so long. And the fact that the police were reflexively defensive, that even the media didn't really pay attention to this angle, that even some members of the community did not fully emphasize or think about race when it came to these victims, that was deeply upsetting to me.
Race plays a big role in this case. It plays a role in the sense that Bruce McArthur, as an older white guy, is not somebody who, on the surface, is somebody who would elicit a lot of attention from police. He's not somebody who is under the same kinds of surveillance that, let's say, a black man or an indigenous man or a brown man who is Muslim is under when they come into Canada. So, in a lot of ways, Bruce McArthur's race helped him evade the authorities for so long. It also plays a role insofar as that some of his victims were also brown men who were living in communities that were not as open and tolerant of the gay lifestyle.
We've seen it in cases of serial killers in the United States who've also preyed on vulnerable members of the community. And so, to me, it does seem that it is an invitation to individuals who are wanting to do such horrific things because they know they can get away with it for a long time. And I think the interactions McArthur had with police over many years, with many different officers, despite many different entry points that should have raised a red flag, is illustrative of that.
McArthur's mistake in the end was thinking that no one would care or notice if his victims lived or died.
Some of the men were known to go to bars or clubs in the village, and they had people that they knew there, and when they went missing for a period of time, it was noticed that they were not there.
This was especially true for Andrew Kinsman, who did not fit the same profile as McArthur's more vulnerable victims.
Andrew Kinsman was a bit of an anomaly. So he had that fixed address, he had that fixed schedule. A lot of these victims, there was quite a delay in the reporting of them being missing. And with Andrew Kinsman, right away, people knew something was wrong and it was completely out of character. I call it
from the 9-1, switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Saw you wanna